April 2023, the heavy metal stamping presses at 402 Kentucky Avenue hit their final stroke, silencing a rhythmic roar that had shaken Indianapolis for over a century. More than 240 workers took off their gloves, packed their toolboxes, and walked out the heavy iron doors for the last time. This wasn't just a factory, it was American bedrock. At its peak, Diamond Chain built the drive systems for the Wright brothers' first flight, Henry Ford's early automobiles, and crucial machinery for World War II. Today, that historic fortress is an empty brick tomb waiting for the wrecking ball. How does a 130-year-old empire, a brand synonymous with unbreakable steel, get erased? It wasn't foreign competition or obsolete products that killed them. It was the cold, calculated math of a corporate buyout. Welcome to the fall of the Diamond Chain Company. This is a story of sweat, steel, and the devastating human cost when corporate balance sheets matter more than the people who built America. The year is 1890. America is standing on the precipice of the Second Industrial Revolution. It is an era defined by steel, steam, and the relentless, deafening pursuit of forward motion. In the heartland of the country, Indianapolis, Indiana, is quietly positioning itself as a crucible of American manufacturing. At the time, the nation is gripped by a sweeping cultural phenomenon, the bicycle craze. Before the automobile dominates the streets, the safety bicycle represents the ultimate freedom of mobility. But to make a bicycle move efficiently, to perfectly transfer human kinetic energy into mechanical speed, requires a marvel of engineering, the roller chain. Enter Arthur Newby, a visionary entrepreneur with an acute understanding of mechanics, metallurgy, and market timing. Newby is a man who looks at a spinning wheel and sees the future of transportation. In 1890, alongside his partners, he establishes the Indianapolis Chain and Stamping Company. Their operation begins modestly, situated in a small brick building, but the ambition behind the walls is towering. Newby understands a fundamental truth of mechanics. A chain is only as strong as its weakest link. In a world where early mass production often leads to compromised, brittle quality, he insists on absolute precision. To signify this unbreakable standard, the company chooses a specific emblem to stamp onto its metal products: a diamond. It is far more than a clever marketing gimmick. A diamond is forged under immense, crushing pressure deep within the earth. It is flawless, it is enduring, and it is the hardest natural substance known to man. This is the promise Arthur Newby makes to his customers: a product without weakness, capable of withstanding the harshest conditions without snapping. Inside those early workshops, the atmosphere is intense. The air is thick with the acrid smell of machine oil, the sharp tang of heated metal, and the pervasive dust of early industrial manufacturing. Men in heavy leather aprons operate the rudimentary stamping presses. Overhead, a maze of leather belts and line shafts powered by steam engines keeps the machinery moving. The workers punch out figure-8 steel side plates, machine microscopic tolerances into hardened steel pins, and fit rollers that must rotate with frictionless, silent grace. It is brutal, deafening work, yet it requires the delicate precision of a master watchmaker. Every single foot of roller chain contains over 100 individual interlocking parts. If one pin is cast poorly, if one plate is warped by a fraction of a millimeter, the entire mechanism fails. The factory floor quickly becomes a symphony of mechanical rhythm. These workers are not just day laborers, they are craftsmen, building the literal connective tissue of a modernizing world. As the 1890s progress, the diamond mark becomes the undisputed gold standard. If you are riding a premium bicycle in America, you are being propelled by Indianapolis steel. But the true test of Diamond Chain's legacy, the moment that elevates them from a successful local business to an immortal piece of global history, arrives at the dawn of the 20th century. Two bicycle mechanics from Dayton, Ohio, are attempting the impossible in absolute secrecy. Wilbur and Orville Wright are building a flying machine. The Wright brothers face a terrifying engineering dilemma. They need to transfer power from their custom-built, violently vibrating aluminum engine to a pair of wooden propellers. Belts will slip off the pulleys. Gears are far too heavy and inflexible. They definitively need a chain drive to power the propellers. But the stakes are unimaginably high. If a bicycle chain snaps, the rider scrapes their knee. If the chain onto the aircraft snaps in midair, the machine will plummet from the sky, and the pilot will likely die. The margin for error is absolute zero. The Wright brothers scour the country for a manufacturer capable of producing a chain that can withstand the violent, unpredictable torque of early aviation. They choose diamond. Remarkably, they do not request a specialized, custom prototype. They purchase standard, production-run diamond chains, trusting the company's baseline, everyday quality with their very lives. On the freezing morning of December 17, 1903, on the windswept dunes of Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, the Wright Flyer's engine sputters to life. The custom sprockets catch. The diamond chains engage perfectly. The wooden propellers spin into a furious blur. And for 12 historic seconds, humanity slips the bonds of gravity. Diamond chain does not merely participate in history, it literally drives the engine of human flight. The monumental success at Kitty Hawk forever transforms the Indianapolis Chain and Stamping Company. They are no longer just building parts for bicycles. They are engineering the vital arteries of the new century. Recognizing the power of their reputation, the name is officially changed to the Diamond Chain Company, cementing the iconic trademark forever. Soon, a young, ambitious industrialist in Detroit named Henry Ford realizes that his early automobiles require that exact same unbreakable reliability. Diamond chains find their way into the earliest American motor cars, establishing Indianapolis not just as the crossroads of America, but as the mechanical heart of the automotive and aerospace revolution. From a humble workshop born out of a localized bicycle trend, Diamond Chain has forged itself into an indispensable titan of American industry. The sparks of innovation have ignited a roaring fire, but a company growing at this explosive rate cannot remain contained in small brick workshops. To meet the voracious appetite of a rapidly industrializing globe, Diamond Chain requires a fortress. They need a facility as massive and unyielding as the steel they forge. The era of the small shop is officially over. The era of the industrial empire is about to begin. By the end of the First World War, the world was moving faster, heavier, and with far more mechanical aggression than ever before. The global appetite for reliable power transmission was insatiable. For the Diamond Chain Company, the original brick workshops that had nurtured their early successes were suddenly bursting at the seams. They were no longer just a prominent supplier for bicycles. They were an indispensable gear in the roaring machinery of global industry. To meet this staggering demand, the company needed more than just a larger workspace. They needed an industrial citadel. In 1918, they found their forever home at 402 Kentucky Avenue, just southwest of downtown Indianapolis. The new facility was a marvel of early 20th century industrial architecture. Spanning multiple city blocks, the imposing four-story structure was built from solid red brick and reinforced concrete, designed not just to house machinery, but to contain the violent, percussive forces of heavy manufacturing. Tall, multi-paned steel grid windows lined the vast exterior, allowing natural light to pierce through the perpetual haze of machine oil and metallic dust that hung into the indoor air. This was not merely a factory. It was a physical manifestation of American manufacturing dominance. It stood as an immovable fortress, casting a long, commanding shadow over the surrounding neighborhoods. For the next century, the building, as it became known to those who walked its floors, would take on a life, a rhythm, and a personality entirely of its own. To step inside to the Kentucky Avenue plant was to step into the belly of a mechanical leviathan. The noise was the first thing that struck you, a solid wall of sound that defied mere description. It was a relentless, polyrhythmic thunder created by hundreds of massive stamping presses, roaring furnaces, and automated assembly machines working in deafening unison. Each press came down with a bone-rattling thud, punching out hardened steel side plates and pins with terrifying, repetitive force. The wooden floorboards literally vibrated beneath the workers' steel-toed boots. You did not just hear the factory, you felt it in your chest, a rhythmic heartbeat of industry that never seemed to rest. Alongside the noise was the distinct, unforgettable aroma, a heavy, masculine blend of ozone, hot grease, quenching oil, and raw sweat. It was an environment that was simultaneously brutal and magnificent. But the true strength of the fortress was never just the bricks, the steel, or the machines. It was the bloodline of its workforce. Diamond Chain did not just employ individuals. It employed entire families. It was incredibly common for a worker to look down the bustling assembly line and see their brother, their father, or even their grandfather operating a neighboring press. The factory floor fostered an intensely tight-knit, almost tribal culture of generational loyalty. These men and women were craftsmen of the highest order, possessing an intuitive, tactile understanding of metallurgy that could not be taught in any university engineering textbook. A veteran worker could tell if a steel pin was machined correctly simply by the pitch of the sound it made. When dropped on a metal workbench, the company sponsored local baseball teams, hosted massive summer picnics, and served as the economic and social anchor for thousands of Indianapolis families. Working at Diamond Chain was not a stepping stone to something else. It was a proud, lifelong identity. You walked in at 18, and you retired at 65 with a gold watch, a solid pension, and deafening memories. This profound marriage between human skill and industrial scale reached its absolute zenith during the Second World War, when the United States military needed flawless power transmission for its rapidly expanding war machine. They turned to Kentucky Avenue. The factory shifted into a relentless overdrive, operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, to support the Allied effort. Diamond chains were seamlessly integrated into the heavy landing gear of military bombers, the operational rotation turrets of tanks, and the heavy cargo elevators of naval battleships. The stakes had never been higher, and the men and women of Indianapolis delivered with a zero margin for error. They were no longer just building commercial parts. They were literally forging the chains of victory. By the time the war ended, Diamond Chain was completely untouchable. They were the undisputed global kings of their industry, and the roaring fortress on Kentucky Avenue was their crown jewel. Yet beneath the deafening success, a dangerous paradigm had been established. In their pursuit of absolute dominance, the company had tethered its entire identity, its culture, and its operational fate to this single, monolithic structure. The fortress on Kentucky Avenue was a masterpiece of 1918 engineering, but heavy industry is inherently unforgiving to the passage of time. A building of that immense, multi-story size requires constant, expensive maintenance. Its sprawling layout, initially a point of immense pride, would eventually clash with the hyper-efficient, single-level flow of modern manufacturing philosophies. By centralizing their soul in one aging brick temple, the workers and the company had unknowingly built a trap. If the world outside those brick walls ever shifted, if the rules of global economics were ever rewritten by men in distant boardrooms who cared nothing for tradition or craftsmanship, the fortress would have nowhere to hide. The golden era was shining brightly, but the seeds of vulnerability were already deeply planted in the concrete floor. The decades immediately following the Second World War represented an unprecedented era of American industrial supremacy. The globe was rebuilding, and it was doing so using American steel, American engineering, and American muscle. In Indianapolis, the Diamond Chain Company was riding the crest of this monumental wave. By the 1950s and 1960s, the fortress on Kentucky Avenue was no longer just a prominent local manufacturer. It was an undisputed global juggernaut. During this golden era, Diamond Chain's product catalog expanded far beyond bicycles and aviation. Their roller chains became the invisible, indestructible arteries pumping life into the modern world. If an oil rig was drilling deep into the Texas dirt, it was likely using a diamond chain. If a massive agricultural combine was harvesting wheat in the Midwest, it relied on Indianapolis steel. From heavy-duty industrial conveyor belts to the intricate timing mechanisms of heavy machinery, the company dominated the market. They were producing thousands of variations of roller chains, each adhering to the flawless, zero-tolerance standards established by Arthur Newby decades prior. Inside the sprawling Kentucky Avenue plant, life settled into a rhythm of absolute, unshakable prosperity. The factory operated around the clock in 3 brutal but highly lucrative shifts. The massive parking lots surrounding the facility were packed with gleaming new American cars, a direct testament to the solid middle-class wages the company provided. This was the pinnacle of the American dream in its purest, most industrial form. A young man could graduate from a local high school on a Friday, walk onto the factory floor on Monday, and secure a job that would not only buy him a house and put his children through college, but also guarantee a comfortable pension for his twilight years. The culture inside the building was intensely communal. It was a self-sustaining ecosystem where generations of families worked side by side. Fathers trained sons, uncles supervised nephews. The workforce shared a profound, unspoken pride. They knew they were making the best product in the world, bar none. The deafening roar of the stamping presses was not viewed as a nuisance. It was the sound of job security. It was the sound of a city thriving. In these years, Diamond Chain felt completely invincible. They held a commanding market share, possessed a fiercely loyal workforce, and operated out of a massive historic facility. But invincibility is often an illusion born of momentum. The company was generating massive amounts of revenue, functioning as a perfectly tuned money-making machine, and in the emerging landscape of modern American capitalism, a highly profitable, independent manufacturing plant is the ultimate prize for predators in tailored suits. The era of the independent, family-oriented manufacturer was drawing to a close. The age of the corporate conglomerate was dawning, and Diamond Chain was about to become a line item on a much larger ledger. In 1967, the fundamental DNA of the Diamond Chain Company was permanently altered. Amstead Industries, a massive Chicago-based industrial conglomerate, purchased the company. On the surface, the acquisition made perfect business sense. Amstead was a holding company looking to diversify its massive portfolio, and Diamond Chain was a highly profitable, self-sustaining asset with a flawless global reputation. For the men and women sweating on the factory floor, the year 1967 came and went without much fanfare. The name on the building remained the same. The heavy iron doors still opened at dawn. The stamping presses still shook the concrete floors, and the steel chains rolling off the assembly lines remained the best in the world. The shift from an independent entity to a corporate subsidiary felt, at first, entirely invisible. The Amstead executives in Chicago were smart enough not to interfere with the daily operations of a machine that was printing money. However, beneath the surface, a slow, insidious shift in financial philosophy was taking root, a shift that would ultimately prove fatal decades down the line. When an independent company makes a massive profit, that capital typically cycles back into its own ecosystem. It pays for a new roof, upgraded electrical systems, or the research and development of more efficient manufacturing technology. But when a company is absorbed by a massive conglomerate, its role changes. It is no longer an independent organism. it becomes a cash cow. Under the Amstead umbrella, the immense profits generated by the blood, sweat, and deafening labor on Kentucky Avenue did not stay in Indianapolis. Instead, the cash flow was siphoned out, redirected to Chicago to fund Amstead's other acquisitions, cover corporate overhead, and satisfy the financial targets of the parent organization. This financial rerouting did not cause immediate damage. The fortress on Kentucky Avenue was built to last, and the machines were incredibly durable. But heavy industry requires constant, aggressive reinvestment to stay competitive. Throughout the 1970s, as the cash flowed out of Indiana, the physical infrastructure of the historic plant began to quietly age. The 1918 building, with its sprawling, multi-story layout, was inherently inefficient compared to the sleek, single-story automated facilities beginning to pop up elsewhere. Yet there was no capital to modernize. The corporate shift had transformed the culture from a proud, autonomous family into a financial instrument. The workers were still producing gold, but they were slowly being starved of the resources needed to maintain their own kingdom. The seeds of decay had been planted in the very foundation of the company. As long as the global economy remained stable, the aging fortress could hold its ground. But the world was about to shrink. The oceans were getting smaller, and a tidal wave of cheap, foreign manufacturing was slowly gathering onto the horizon, preparing to crash directly into the fragile, underfunded walls of American industry. As the calendar turned to the 1980s, the economic tectonic plates beneath the United States began a violent and irreversible shift. The era of undisputed American manufacturing dominance was over, replaced by a new, ruthless paradigm: globalization. The oceans that had once protected domestic industries were suddenly rendered obsolete by massive container ships, advanced logistics networks, and a newly connected global supply chain. For companies entrenched in the American Midwest, the region was slowly earning a grim new moniker that would haunt it for decades: the Rust Belt. At 402 Kentucky Avenue, the men and women of Diamond Chain were continuing to do what they had always done, forging the most flawless, durable roller chains on the planet. But the rules of the game were being rewritten by invisible hands in distant markets. A flood of cheap, foreign-made steel products began pouring into the United States. These imported chains were not engineered to the meticulous, zero-tolerance standards established by Arthur Newby. They were often brittle, imperfect, and carried a significantly shorter operational lifespan. But they possessed one undeniable advantage that captivated the modern business world: they were incredibly cheap. This created a profound philosophical crisis for Diamond Chain. How do you compete in a global market that no longer values absolute perfection? For nearly a century, the company's entire identity was built on the solemn promise that their chain would never break under pressure. Now, a new breed of corporate procurement officers, executives armed with spreadsheets rather than engineering degrees, were deciding that a mechanical chain didn't actually need to last forever. It simply needed to last long enough, and it needed to cost a fraction of the price. The pressure on the factory floor became immediately palpable. The workers at Diamond Chain were not merely fighting rival companies, they were fighting the very concept of the minimal marginal cost. They watched nervously as other historic factories across Indianapolis and the broader Midwest shuttered their doors, completely unable to compete with the aggressively low labor rates of developing nations. The deafening roar of the stamping presses at Diamond Chain continued to shake the floorboards, but it was now laced with a quiet, creeping anxiety. The workers knew their craftsmanship was vastly superior, but they also recognized a terrifying truth: that superiority was becoming a luxury the modern industrial world was increasingly unwilling to pay for. Inside the fortress on Kentucky Avenue, the harsh reality of this new globalized economy was manifesting in physical decay. The brilliant 1918 architectural marvel that had once been the company's greatest asset was rapidly becoming its heaviest anchor. Operating a sprawling, multi-story brick facility in the modern era is catastrophically expensive. Moving tons of heavy raw steel and finished products up and down aging freight elevators across 4 separate floors destroyed any hope of modern. Streamlined workflow efficiency, heating the cavernous spaces in the brutal Indiana winters, and cooling them in the sweltering summers drained vital capital that should have been used for innovation. Meanwhile, Amstead Industries, the corporate parent sitting in Chicago, was not interested in pouring millions of dollars into retrofitting a century-old building. The mandate handed down to the local management in Indianapolis was brutally simple. Do more with less. Keep the profit margins up. Compete with the aggressive overseas pricing, but do it using the aging machinery and the multi-story labyrinth you already have. The burden of this impossible mathematical equation fell squarely onto the shoulders of the workers. The familial, generational culture that had defined Diamond Chain began to fracture under the immense weight of rigid production quotas and relentless cost-cutting measures. Veteran machinists, who had spent decades mastering the tactile art of metallurgy, were now pressured to find ways to speed up processes, often at the expense of the meticulous care they had been taught to revere. The immense pride of creating an unbreakable American product was slowly being overshadowed by the desperate, exhausting need to simply keep the factory doors open. Despite the seemingly insurmountable odds, the workforce held the line. Through the 1990s and into the 2000s, by sheer force of will, grit, and unparalleled institutional knowledge, the people of Diamond Chain kept the Kentucky Avenue plant profitable. They weathered the violent storms of economic recessions and the relentless tide of cheap imports. They proved day in and day out that American craftsmanship still had a pulse. But they were exhausted. They were fighting a brutal war of attrition inside a crumbling castle. They had survived the initial onslaught of globalization, but they were left battered, underfunded, and highly vulnerable. And in the modern corporate ecosystem, a vulnerable, aging asset is a prime target. The true fatal blow for the Indianapolis empire would not come from a foreign competitor across the ocean. It would come from another American corporation bearing bright promises of synergy while quietly holding a knife. By 2019, the Diamond Chain Company had survived over a century of profound economic turbulence and immense industrial shifts. The men and women inside the fortress on Kentucky Avenue had weathered the Great Depression, powered the terrifying machinery of the Second World War, and fought a grueling, decades-long battle of attrition against the relentless tide of cheap overseas manufacturing. They were bruised, operating inside an aging, century-old facility that desperately needed a massive capital injection. But they were still standing. They were still the proud, uncompromising custodians of a legendary American brand. Then, in the spring of that year, a seismic shift occurred in the corporate atmosphere above them. Amstead Industries, the massive conglomerate that had treated the Indianapolis plant as a quiet, cash-generating subsidiary for over 50 years, finally decided it was time to sell the historic asset. The buyer, stepping up to the negotiating table, was the Timken Company. To the outside financial world, this acquisition made perfect strategic sense. Timken, headquartered in North Canton, Ohio, was a towering titan in the global industrial sector, specializing heavily in engineered bearings and mechanical power transmission products. Unlike Amstead, which operated as a highly diversified holding company with interests spanning multiple unrelated industries, Timken spoke the distinct, heavy language of industrial motion. They possessed a deep, century-old pedigree of their own, having been founded in 1899, when the $120 million acquisition was finalized and announced in April 2019. The corporate press releases were predictably flooded with the optimistic buzzwords of modern mergers. Executives spoke enthusiastically about strategic alignment, enhancing the global power transmission portfolio, and achieving dynamic synergies across their expanded footprint. Inside the sprawling, brick-walled labyrinth of the Kentucky Avenue plant, this news was initially met with a cautious, collective sigh of relief. For the exhausted workforce, the arrival of Timken felt like a long overdue rescue mission arriving just in the nick of time. The workers had spent decades watching their historic facilities slowly decay around them due to a severe lack of reinvestment. Now, they were being absorbed by an industrial giant with notoriously deep pockets and a fierce reputation for dominating the exact market Diamond Chain operated in. The factory floor buzzed with a renewed, fragile sense of hope that had been absent for a generation. Veteran machinists who had spent 30 years coaxing perfection out of aging equipment speculated that Timken's vast resources would finally bring much-needed modernizations to the Indianapolis facility. They envisioned new, highly efficient stamping presses, modernized climate control for the cavernous workspaces to combat the brutal Indiana summers, and a complete revitalization of the Diamond brand under a parent company that actually understood the intricate nuances of heavy manufacturing. For a brief, fleeting moment, it seemed as though the golden era of the Diamond Chain Company might actually be resurrected. The workers allowed themselves to believe that their unparalleled craftsmanship, their fierce loyalty, and their absolute dedication to quality had finally been recognized and rewarded by a respected industry peer. They believed their jobs and their legacy were finally secure. But this sudden burst of optimism was a dangerous illusion, born from a fundamental misunderstanding of how modern corporate consolidation actually operates. The blue-collar workers on Kentucky Avenue viewed the acquisition through the honorable lens of industrial pride. They believed Timken was buying their century of expertise, their daily sweat, and their historic manufacturing capabilities. They did not realize that in the cold, hyper-efficient mathematical reality of 21st century Wall Street, an acquiring corporation is rarely interested in preserving a historic ecosystem just for the sake of tradition. They are purchasing market share, intellectual property, and a prestigious brand name. The physical factory and the human beings toiling inside it are frequently viewed as secondary variables, or worse, as expendable redundancies. The honeymoon period was brutally short-lived. The concept of corporate synergy, a word heavily championed during the initial acquisition, rarely means what the working class hopes it means. In the boardrooms of global conglomerates, synergy is not about combining forces to build a stronger, more robust community. It is a sterilized, corporate euphemism for eliminating overlapping costs. To increase the profit margin of the newly acquired asset and justify the purchase price to their shareholders, the parent company must ruthlessly trim the fat. And the executives at Timken quickly realized they had a massive, glaring overlap in their domestic manufacturing portfolio. Years prior, in 2011, Timken had acquired another major player in the industrial chain manufacturing industry, Drives LLC, based in Fulton, Illinois. When Timken proudly added Diamond Chain to its roster in 2019, they suddenly owned two separate, massive domestic facilities producing similar heavy-duty power transmission products. From a purely operational standpoint, maintaining two distinct manufacturing plants separated by just a few hundred miles was an unacceptable inefficiency on a financial spreadsheet. As the months ticked by following the acquisition, the atmosphere inside the Kentucky Avenue plant began to curdle and sour. The highly anticipated investments never arrived. The modern stamping presses were never ordered. The structural repairs to the 1918 building were perpetually delayed. Instead, the workers noticed a different kind of corporate presence filtering through the heavy iron doors. executives, efficiency analysts, and logistics consultants in tailored suits began walking the dirty, vibrating factory floor with clipboards and electronic tablets. These men were not there to learn the intricate, tactile art of metallurgy from the veteran craftsmen. They were conducting a silent, meticulous, and entirely unsentimental audit of the facility's viability. They measured the astronomical cost of heating the multi-story, poorly insulated brick building. They calculated the financial drag of moving heavy steel freight up and down the aging freight elevators across 4 separate floors. They ruthlessly compared the operational overhead of the Indianapolis workforce against the capacity of their facility in Illinois. The men and women operating the loud, shaking machines could feel the invisible crosshairs settling firmly on their backs. The initial illusion of a corporate rescue had completely evaporated, replaced by a suffocating, undeniable dread that hung in the air thicker than the metallic dust. The historic fortress on Kentucky Avenue was not going to be saved and modernized. It was actively being measured for its coffin. The stage was now perfectly set for a boardroom decision that would prioritize quarterly earnings over a 130-year legacy of American exceptionalism. Far away from the deafening rhythmic thunder of the stamping presses on Kentucky Avenue, the true fate of the Diamond Chain Company was being decided in a terrifyingly quiet environment. In the sleek, climate-controlled corporate boardrooms of the Timken Company in North Canton, Ohio, there was no smell of heated machine oil. There was no vibration of heavy steel beneath the floorboards, and there was no collective, generational memory of Arthur Newby or the Wright brothers. There were only digital projections, financial spreadsheets, and the cold, unyielding mechanics of corporate consolidation. To understand the death of a historic American factory in the 21st century, one must understand how modern industrial holding companies view their empires. They do not look at a map and see communities, legacies, or families. They see a sprawling grid of operational overhead, supply chain logistics, and overlapping capabilities. When Timken executives analyzed their newly expanded power transmission portfolio in late 2019 and early 2020, they immediately zeroed in on a glaring redundancy in the American Midwest. 8 years prior to purchasing Diamond Chain, Timken had acquired Drives LLC, a massive manufacturer of heavy-duty roller chains based in Fulton, Illinois. Drives LLC was a highly capable, high-volume facility. Now, with the $120 million acquisition of Diamond Chain finalized, Timken found itself owning 2 entirely separate, massive domestic manufacturing plants, producing essentially the same category of industrial products, separated by merely 300 miles of interstate highway. In the hyper-competitive arena of global manufacturing, operating 2 parallel facilities is viewed as an unacceptable financial sin. Maintaining 2 separate management teams, paying 2 separate property tax bills, and funding 2 separate maintenance budgets dilutes the overall profit margin. The mandate from the Timken shareholders was not to preserve American history. It was to maximize quarterly earnings. The corporate analysts were tasked with a brutal, singular objective: determine which of the 2 facilities would absorb the other. It was a corporate gladiator match. And the historic fortress in Indianapolis was stepping into the arena with severe structural handicaps. The analysts descended on the numbers with surgical detachment. They did not factor in the peerless craftsmanship of the Indianapolis workers, nor did they assign a monetary value to the immense pride that had sustained the Kentucky Avenue plant for over a century. Instead, they measured to the catastrophic inefficiency of the 1918 architecture. They calculated the exorbitant cost of heating the 4-story brick cavern during the freezing Indiana winters. They tracked the wasted man-hours and logistical friction required to load raw steel onto aging freight elevators, move it up to the 3rd floor for stamping, down to the 2nd floor for assembly, and back to the ground floor for shipping. The historic building, once the greatest symbol of Diamond Chain's undeniable might, was now the very weapon being used to execute it. The tragic irony of modern industrial buyouts is that a factory does not necessarily need to be failing in order to be completely destroyed. It only needs to be deemed slightly less profitable than a consolidated alternative. The workers at Diamond Chain were not losing money. They were still producing the finest, most durable roller chains on the global market. But in the modern corporate ecosystem, simple profitability is no longer enough. The margin must always grow. When the financial models were fully rendered in North Canton, the math was devastatingly clear. The facility in Fulton, Illinois, operated on a much more modern, streamlined, single-level manufacturing footprint. It did not require millions of dollars in deferred structural maintenance just to keep the roof from leaking or the brick facades from crumbling. By closing the Indianapolis plant entirely, physically uprooting its best machinery, and shifting the production volume to Illinois, Timken could eliminate hundreds of salaries, slash their regional utility costs in half, and completely liquidate a massive piece of real estate in a rapidly gentrifying area of downtown Indianapolis. The immediate cost of severing over 200 employees and physically relocating heavy machinery would be high, but the long-term annual savings would look spectacular on Timken's year-end earnings reports. The executives were looking at an equation where erasing 130 years of industrial heritage equaled a permanent bump in shareholder value. In a boardroom hundreds of miles away from the people whose lives were about to be shattered, the decision was finalized. There was no grand debate about the moral obligation a company has to the community that built it. There was no consideration for the fathers and sons who had spent their entire adult lives mastering a highly specialized trade within those specific brick walls. The 130-year legacy of Arthur Newby, the unbreakable chains that had powered Henry Ford's earliest dreams, and the vital components that had helped win the Second World War, none of it could be quantified into a cell on an Excel spreadsheet. Therefore, in the eyes of the corporate hierarchy, it simply held no value. The death warrant for 402 Kentucky Avenue was quietly signed, sealed, and prepared for delivery. The Timken takeover, which had initially masqueraded as a saving grace for the exhausted Indianapolis workforce, was finally revealing its true predatory nature. The century-old roar of the mighty stamping presses had not been defeated by foreign competition or a lack of domestic skill. It had been defeated by a calculator. The end did not come with a catastrophic structural failure, nor did it arrive via a sudden bankruptcy. It came in the form of a mandatory all-hands meeting. On a brisk day, the relentless, deafening rhythm of the Kentucky Avenue plant was deliberately paused. Over 240 men and women, machinists, assembly line workers, maintenance staff, and floor supervisors, were instructed to power down their equipment, wipe the heavy grease from their hands, and gather on the factory floor. The silence that fell over the cavernous brick building in that moment was unnatural. For a workforce accustomed to communicating through hand signals over the roar of industrial machinery, the quiet was suffocating. Standing before them were representatives of the corporate hierarchy, armed with prepared statements and transition packets. The delivery was clinical, rehearsed, and devastatingly brief. The Timken Company, after a thorough review of its operational footprint, had made the strategic decision to consolidate its roller chain manufacturing operations. The historic diamond chain facility in Indianapolis was to be permanently shuttered. Production would be shifted entirely to the Drives LLC plant in Fulton, Illinois. The 240 jobs anchored to the Isintikinas goal in 1980 as a Wakasumtikio 18 fortress were being eliminated. The immediate reaction on the floor was not a cinematic outburst of chaos. It was a profound, paralyzing shock. It was the collective gasp of a community having the wind knocked out of its chest. For the executives reading the statement, This was simply the execution of a logistical optimization plan. But for the people wearing the heavy leather aprons and steel-toed boots, it was a sudden, violent death sentence for their way of life. As the reality of the announcement set in, the shock rapidly metabolized into a deep, acidic anger. This was not a transient workforce of temporary laborers. Diamond Chain was built on a fierce generational loyalty. Standing in that crowd were men and women in their 40s and 50s who had never worked anywhere else. They had walked through those heavy iron doors, fresh out of high school, taking up positions next to their fathers, and in some cases their grandfathers. Their entire identities, their financial security, and their social circles were inextricably woven into the fabric of the building. The betrayal felt absolute. They had played by the rules. They had sacrificed their hearing, their joints, and their youth to produce the finest steel chains on the planet. They had kept the company highly profitable through decades of grueling economic recessions and the relentless onslaught of cheap globalization. And in the end, none of that unparalleled dedication mattered. Their craftsmanship had been weighed against the cost of heating a century-old building, and the building had lost. The unbreakable bond between the American worker and the American manufacturer had been severed in a matter of minutes by a corporate decree. If the announcement was a sudden execution, the months that followed were an agonizing, prolonged funeral. Modern corporate closures are rarely instantaneous. To ensure a smooth transition of the supply chain and maintain product flow for existing clients, the factory had to remain operational while it was actively being dismantled. For the 240 workers on Kentucky Avenue, this created a deeply cruel psychological purgatory. They were offered severance packages, but the financial payout was contingent on their cooperation through the final days. They had to stay. They had to continue walking into the aging brick fortress every single morning, punching the clock and firing up the machines, knowing exactly when the axe was going to fall. Worse still was the bitter process of knowledge transfer. The highly specialized, zero-tolerance stamping machines that Diamond Chain utilized could not simply be plugged into a new wall in Illinois and operated by novices. The equipment required to the intuitive touch of the Indianapolis veterans. In one of the most agonizing phases of the transition, the very workers who were losing their livelihoods were tasked with breaking down their own workstations, cataloging the microscopic calibrations, and in some cases, training the personnel who would be taking over the consolidated production line in Fulton. They were essentially digging their own professional graves, and they were expected to do it with a polite corporate smile. Slowly, the physical dismantling of the empire began. The factory floor, once a dense, vibrant maze of heavy machinery and constant motion, started to empty out. Massive flatbed trucks arrived at the loading docks week after week. The towering stamping presses, some of which had shaken the concrete floors of Indianapolis for decades, were unbolted, hoisted by heavy cranes, and shipped away. As the machinery disappeared, the unique acoustic signature of the building began to change. The deafening polyrhythmic roar that had defined the neighborhood for a century grew weaker, replaced by the hollow, echoing sounds of a cavernous, empty space. Sections of the factory went completely dark. The camaraderie that had sustained the workforce evaporated into a grim, silent professionalism. Men and women who had spent their entire lives side by side began saying their final goodbyes, packing up toolboxes that had sat on the same workbenches for 30 years. They were not just losing a paycheck. They were being forcefully ejected into a modern economy that had very little use for heavy industrial craftsmen. The world outside the brick walls was dominated by tech startups, logistics warehouses, and gig economy apps. The specialized, tactile knowledge of how to forge a flawless steel roller chain was suddenly obsolete in their own hometown. The countdown clock on the wall was ticking relentlessly toward the final day. And with every machine that was hauled out the door, the soul of the Diamond Chain Company was stripped further away, leaving only an empty brick shell waiting for the end. The end of a 130-year-old industrial lineage did not arrive with a dramatic explosion or a sudden collapse. It arrived on a painfully ordinary spring day in April 2023. For the final time, the men and women of the Diamond Chain Company pulled their cars into the sprawling lot surrounding 402 Kentucky Avenue. They walked through the heavy iron doors, swiped their badges, and stepped onto the wooden floorboards that had been worn smooth by generations of steel-toed boots. The morning routine was identical to the thousands of mornings that had preceded it, guided by muscle memory and a profound sense of duty. But beneath the surface, the atmosphere was suffocatingly heavy. Today they were not just building roller chains, they were presiding over a funeral. For the first few hours of that final shift, the factory floor sounded exactly as it always had. The massive stamping presses pounded with their rhythmic, bone-rattling thunder. The heat-treating furnaces hummed with intense, glowing energy, baking the hardened steel to absolute perfection. The distinct metallic scent of cutting fluid and hot grease hung thick in the air. If you closed your eyes and simply listened, you could still believe you were standing in the invincible mechanical heart of the American Midwest. The workers moved with the same meticulous precision they had always possessed, even on their final day, facing the complete evaporation of their livelihoods. There was no sabotage, no corner cutting, and no drop in quality. They were craftsmen until the very last second. But an industrial plant of that magnitude does not die all at once. The shutdown was a phased, methodical execution. By mid-morning, the raw material intake lines were halted. The massive spools of raw steel wire and the heavy pallets of metal plating were depleted and not restocked. Then the first wave of heavy stamping presses finished their final run. Operators reached out and threw the heavy electrical disconnect switches. With a heavy mechanical sigh, the massive flywheels spun down, slower and slower, until they finally locked into their permanent resting positions. One by one, down the sprawling assembly lines, the machines were killed. The automated assemblies, which had seamlessly linked millions of intricate steel components, went completely dark. The colossal metallurgical furnaces, which had burned at over 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit for decades, were finally deprived of their fuel. As the burners were extinguished, the metal housing of the furnaces began to ping and groan, contracting as the immense heat slowly bled out of the steel. As the sequential shutdown progressed across the four-story facility, a terrifying new presence invaded the Kentucky Avenue plant: silence. For a building that had literally vibrated with the violent percussive energy of heavy manufacturing since 1918, the sudden acoustic vacuum was entirely unnatural. The polyrhythmic roar that had defined this neighborhood, the sound that had guaranteed mortgages and put children through college, simply ceased to exist. In its place was a hollow, echoing stillness. As the airborne metallic dust began to settle in the shafts of sunlight piercing it through the multi-paned grid windows, the factory floor felt less like a workspace and more like a cathedral that had been abruptly abandoned. With the machinery dead, the workers turned to the agonizing task of dismantling their own lives. Heavy steel toolboxes, many bearing the faded stickers and scuff marks of 30-year careers, were snapped shut. The sharp, echoing clack of a toolbox latch closing became the final, defining sound of the diamond chain era. Men and women who possessed the tough, stoic exteriors required of heavy industrial labor openly wept. They embraced one another, not just as colleagues, but as a fractured family. They were mourning the loss of their incomes, certainly, but they were also mourning the sudden erasure of their collective identity. In the early afternoon, the final group of workers gathered their belongings, took one last look at the silent iron giants they had commanded for decades, and walked toward the exits. They pushed open the doors and stepped out into the bright Indianapolis sunlight. Behind them, the heavy doors clicked shut and locked. Just like that, it was over. The blood had officially been drained from the beast. The historic fortress at 402 Kentucky Avenue, the very facility that had armed the American military, powered the early automotive industry, and sustained thousands of families, was no longer a factory. It was now just a massive, empty brick shell sitting silently on a highly valuable piece of downtown real estate. The machines had been silenced, the workers had been exiled, and the long, agonizing wait for the wrecking ball had officially begun. The weeks that followed the final shutdown of the diamond chain plant in April 2023 were defined by a profound, unnatural stillness. The historic fortress at 402 Kentucky Avenue, a structure that had practically breathed with the violent, percussive rhythm of heavy manufacturing for over a century, was abruptly reduced to a dormant, echoing cavern. The towering grid windows, which had once filtered to the afternoon sun through thick clouds of metallic dust and machine oil, now illuminated nothing but bare concrete floors and the ghostly outlines where massive stamping presses used to sit. The 240 men and women who had given their youth, their joints, and their unparalleled craftsmanship to the company were gone, scattered into a modern service economy that had little use for their highly specialized tactile skills. But the tragedy of the Diamond Chain Company was not confined merely to the loss of jobs or the silencings of the machinery. In the modern landscape of American deindustrialization, the death of a factory is almost always followed by a secondary, far more permanent phase of destruction, the erasure of its physical footprint. The sprawling, multi-story brick complex did not sit empty for long. In the ruthless, hyper-accelerated world of commercial real estate, a century of industrial heritage is rarely viewed as a monument to be preserved. It is viewed as an underutilized asset occupying highly valuable acreage. The plant was strategically located just southwest of downtown Indianapolis, positioned near the winding banks of the White River and sitting squarely in the shadow of Lucas Oil Stadium. The surrounding neighborhoods, once heavily blue-collar and defined by the manufacturing plants that anchored them, were undergoing a rapid, aggressive wave of gentrification. To the corporate executives at Timken, the massive, aging brick facility was an expensive liability they had successfully offloaded. But to urban developers, the land beneath it was a literal gold mine. Shortly after the final lock was turned on the heavy iron doors, the property was sold to real estate developers with a vision that stood in stark, almost insulting contrast to the site's gritty, blue-collar history. The blueprints for the future of 402 Kentucky Avenue did not involve heavy machinery, metallurgical innovation, or generational craftsmanship. Instead, the sprawling industrial footprint was slated to be transformed into a sterilized, mixed-use development complex. The preliminary plans called for the demolition of massive sections of the historic factory to make way for luxury apartment buildings, high-end retail spaces, and manicured commercial plazas. The heavy, oil-stained wooden floorboards that had supported the weight of World War II production lines were destined to be replaced by polished concrete flooring for boutique coffee shops and upscale dining establishments. This transition represented the ultimate, undeniable triumph of the modern consumption economy over the traditional production economy. For 130 years, this specific plot of land was dedicated to creating unbreakable things. It was a place where raw, heavy materials were forged into the essential connective tissue of the modern world. Now it was being repurposed exclusively for leisure and lifestyle. As the demolition crews eventually arrived to begin gutting the facility, tearing down the aging brick facades, and ripping out the heavy industrial infrastructure, a second death occurred. The physical erasure of the diamond chain plant meant the permanent erasure of the neighborhood's working-class identity. When a factory is simply closed but left standing, it remains as a silent, towering memorial to the people who built it. But when the walls are torn down and the foundation is paved over with luxury apartments, the collective memory of the community is bulldozed alongside it. Future generations walking down Kentucky Avenue will have no visual cue, no towering brick smokestacks to remind them that this exact soil once produced the drive chains that propelled the Wright brothers into the sky. They will not know that thousands of families achieved the American dream by sweating over hot furnaces on this very corner. The legacy of Arthur Newby's absolute demand for perfection, the unbreakable steel that powered Henry Ford's early automobiles, and the deafening roar that defined the crossroads of America for a century will simply vanish beneath layers of fresh asphalt and modern landscaping. The fall of the Diamond Chain Company is a masterclass in the cold, unyielding mechanics of the modern corporate era. It proves that no matter how vital a company is to the foundation of the country, no matter how flawless its product is, and no matter how fiercely loyal its workforce remains, everything can be dismantled by a boardroom thousands of miles away. The machines have been silenced, the workers have been exiled, and now the empire itself has been completely erased from the map, leaving behind nothing but the fading echoes of a time when America actually built things meant to last forever. The tragic paradox of the Diamond Chain Company lies in the very product that made them immortal. For 130 years, the men and women of Indianapolis dedicated their lives to forging connections that would never snap under pressure. They built the literal links that allowed humanity to take to the skies, conquer the roads, and win global conflicts. Their chains were designed to be absolutely unbreakable. Yet the ultimate downfall of this historic empire had nothing to do with the strength of its steel. It was the human connections, the bonds between a corporation and its workforce, between a manufacturer and its hometown, that proved devastatingly fragile. When the relentless modern pressure of corporate consolidation was applied, the boardroom simply snapped. The story of 402 Kentucky Avenue is not merely an isolated tale of a single factory closing. It is a stark reflection of a much broader American industrial tragedy. We have transitioned into an era where the hyper-efficient pursuit of quarterly profit margins has consistently dismantled the foundational institutions that built the middle class. We are trading massive monuments of heavy industry and generational craftsmanship for sterilized, mixed-use developments and optimized financial spreadsheets. The physical fortress of Diamond Chain may soon be reduced to dust and echoes, paved over by luxury apartments and boutique retail spaces. But the legacy of what those workers achieved, the meticulous, unyielding perfection they demanded of themselves every single day, cannot be erased by a corporate mandate or a wrecking ball. For over a century, they were the mechanical heartbeat of the nation, and they built things meant to last forever. What do you think is the true long-term cost of erasing these industrial cornerstones from our cities? Is there a way to balance modern corporate efficiency with the preservation of American manufacturing heritage, or is this the inevitable price of progress? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found value in this story and want to help us uncover more lost histories, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like. Your support is the only way we can continue documenting the forgotten empires of our past. Until next time, thank you for watching.